This is Crime Scene Confidential, where the world's darkest true crime stories aren't just told, they're experienced. Every week we bring you cases that slip through the cracks, the twisted, the disturbing, the ones you'll never forget. I'm Clint. Let's get into today's story. This video contains sensitive and disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. It was just after 4 a.m. on a freezing February night when a 911 dispatcher in Pennsylvania answered a call they would never forget. On the line was a teenage girl. She was panicked, crying. Her voice trembled with something between horror and disbelief. And then she said the words that would shake an entire community. I just killed my sister. Moments later, police officers arrived at a quiet home in Manheim Township, a suburban neighborhood that rarely made headlines. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where the loudest sound at night was the wind rustling through bare trees. But that night, something unspeakable had happened behind those closed doors. The girl who had made the call was standing outside on the porch when they arrived. Her name was Claire Miller. She was just 14 years old. She was covered in blood, waving the officers down with shaking hands, and trying desperately to clean herself off using the snow on the ground, rubbing her hands raw, as if that could erase what she'd done. Inside the house, the officers found her older sister, Helen. Helen Miller was 19 years old. She had cerebral palsy. She used a wheelchair and was nonverbal. She couldn't scream. She couldn't fight back. She had been asleep when Claire walked into her room with a kitchen knife. This isn't a movie script. It's not an urban legend or an internet ARG. This is real. A real crime involving real people. And it unfolded in the most modern, surreal way possible. Through social media, viral speculation, and a nation trying to make sense of something so senseless. Before we go any further, I want to be clear. This case is disturbing. It includes graphic descriptions of violence, discussions of mental health, disability, family trauma. If any of that is triggering for you, emotionally or personally, this may not be the story for you. Please take care of yourself first. Step away if you need to. No video is more important than your peace of mind. And while it's tempting to look at a story like this with morbid curiosity, I want to remind you, this isn't just a headline. This isn't just a crime. This was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's life. Helen Miller mattered. Too often in stories like these, the focus shifts to the killer, to their motives, their background, their mental state. But in the process, the victim fades into the background. That's not going to happen here. Helen's story deserves to be told too. I'm Clint. This is another Crime Scene Confidential production. And this is the story of Claire Miller, the teenager the internet dubbed the TikTok killer, and the sister whose voice was never heard, but who deserves to be remembered. Let's begin. The call came in at 4:02 a.m. on February 22nd, 2021. The dispatcher who answered heard nothing at first but frantic breathing, then a choked sob, then the words, "I stabbed my sister." It's hard to imagine the kind of panic that would lead a 14-year-old to say that out loud, to even form those words with her own mouth. But Claire Miller didn't just say them. She repeated them, over and over, as if maybe by saying it again, she could make it untrue, as if repeating it enough might rewind the last few minutes of her life. By the time police arrived, Claire was already outside waiting for them. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing on her front porch, waving them down through the cold Pennsylvania dark. There was blood on her hands, her arms, her pajama pants, and in a detail that would stick with the responding officers forever. She had been trying to wipe the blood off in the snow. Tiny streaks of red stained the white powder beneath her feet. Police would later say it looked like she had crouched down in the yard and rubbed her hands back and forth in the snow, desperate to make the mess go away, to make her hands clean again. But it hadn't worked. There was too much of it. When officers asked what happened, Claire reportedly just kept saying one thing: "I stopped my sister." Not "I hurt her." Not "I lost control." "I stopped her." It didn't make sense. Not then. Not yet. The officers entered the home cautiously. It was quiet, no sign of a struggle. Claire's parents were still asleep. Then they stepped into Helen's room. Helen was lying in bed, flat on her back. A pillow had been placed over her face. The knife, the same kitchen knife used in the attack, was still lodged in her neck. There was blood on the sheets, the walls, the floor. It was everywhere, and Helen wasn't moving. The officers called for paramedics immediately. Even though they knew it was probably too late, they tried. They attempted CPR. They did everything they could to revive her. But it didn't matter. Helen Miller was pronounced dead at 4:13 a.m. She was 19 years old. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that Helen was nonverbal. She couldn't call for help, couldn't scream, couldn't ask her parents for protection, couldn't beg her sister to stop. She would have woken up to see Claire standing over her, someone she trusted, someone she shared her life with. We don't know how long it took. We don't know what Claire was thinking. But what we do know is this: something happened inside that house that night that can never be undone. Within the hour, the news began to spread. A teenager had confessed to murdering her own sister in their family home. And before anyone had time to process it, social media was already on fire with speculation. Because Claire Miller wasn't just a teenager, she was a TikToker. And that fact alone would soon turn this quiet, tragic story into a viral frenzy. To understand how shocking this crime was, how unimaginable, it helps to know a little bit about the Miller family. From the outside, they were the picture of stability. They lived in a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood in Manheim Township, part of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a place where crimes like this just don't happen. Their home was a one-story ranch-style house, the kind of place that feels warm and familiar. White shutters, a small yard. Nothing about it screamed tragedy. Claire Miller lived there with her parents, Mark and Marie Elena Miller, and her older sister, Helen. Claire was 14 at the time of the murder, a ninth grader at Lancaster Country Day School, a private college prep school known for small class sizes, academic rigor, and an impressive price tag. Students there wore uniforms, took advanced placement classes, played on well-funded sports teams. Claire wasn't the most popular girl in school, but she wasn't an outcast either. She was described as quiet, a little quirky, sometimes dark in her humor, but nothing alarming. She was also active on TikTok, posting under the handle at Spirits and Such Consulting, a reference to the anime Mob Psycho 100. Her content was typical for her age: anime edits, lip sync videos, inside jokes, and occasional rants about school or her parents. Nothing you wouldn't see on 1,000 other accounts. Helen, her sister, was 5 years older, 19. She had cerebral palsy, a neurological disorder that affects movement, muscle tone, and posture. Because of her disability, Helen used a wheelchair. She was nonverbal, meaning she couldn't speak aloud, but that didn't mean she didn't communicate. Helen had a rich inner life. She was creative. She was funny. She had a smile that people remembered. In the limited public records and sparse obituary notices, she's described as someone who brought light into every room she entered. She was an artist. She painted and sculpted. One of her watercolor pieces even won an award. But perhaps most importantly, Helen was loved. She was not some tragic background character. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend, and she deserved to live a full, beautiful life. To their credit, the Millers appeared to be a supportive family. In 2005, when Helen was still a child, her parents established an irrevocable trust in her name, ensuring that she would have access to the resources and care she needed well into adulthood. It wasn't just a legal move, it was a sign of planning, protection, long-term commitment. That kind of decision tells you something. It tells you they were thinking about her future, that they wanted her taken care of, even if something ever happened to them. And according to those who knew them, the two sisters got along, at least publicly. Claire would often accompany Helen to her medical appointments. She would help wheel her through hospital corridors, wait in the lobbies, sit beside her during long procedures. That's not something a child does if there's open hostility. But as we know all too well, appearances can be deceiving. What happens behind closed doors, especially in families with a child who has complex needs, is often messy, complicated, sometimes painful. Still, no one could have predicted what would happen on that February morning. A quiet family, a supportive household, two sisters, one knife. And the silence that followed was deafening. February 21st, 2021. The day before everything changed seemed ordinary, at least from the outside looking in. Claire Miller was active on TikTok that day. She posted a video, one of many. It didn't hint at violence. It didn't suggest any kind of mental break. It was just typical content. A silly lip sync. A fleeting moment captured and shared with her 22,000 followers. And that's what makes it so chilling in retrospect. That just hours before the murder, Claire was doing something so normal, something so casual, something millions of other teens do every day without a second thought. It raises the question, how do you go from filming TikToks in the afternoon to murder in the middle of the night? That evening, sometime before midnight, Claire also reportedly had a conversation with a friend. This friend would later come forward, claiming that Claire had confided in them. According to this witness, Claire said she was having homicidal and suicidal thoughts.
Claire was a kid who had it all, but was obsessed with homicide, citing thousands of text messages she sent a friend expressing a desire to harm someone.
Now, let's pause on that for a second, because that is a major red flag. If the claim is true, it means Claire verbalized dangerous ideation just hours before the murder took place. But here's the frustrating part. We don't know if that friend told anyone in time. We don't know if there was an opportunity for intervention, or if that warning was dismissed as teenage dramatics. It's possible Claire didn't give any details. It's possible she didn't seem serious. But it's possible that someone heard the alarm bells and didn't know how to respond. This is something we don't talk about enough. How difficult it is to gauge the seriousness of mental health disclosures, especially from young people, especially online. Sometimes they're cries for help. Sometimes they're impulsive venting. And sometimes they're warnings we don't realize we should have taken seriously until it's too late. That night, Claire's parents went to bed. Helen went to bed, and Claire stayed awake. We don't know what was going through her mind, whether she was planning something, or spiraling, or dissociating entirely. There are no text messages, no journal entries, no late-night live streams to explain what came next. No one saw it coming, and that's part of what makes this case so horrifying. There was no long history of violence, no documented abuse, no escalating behavioral issues that made this feel inevitable. Claire Miller didn't snap in a crowded classroom. She didn't lash out at a stranger on the street. She walked quietly through her house in the middle of the night. She picked up a kitchen knife, and she entered her sister's bedroom. Whatever was happening in her mind, whatever rage, confusion, pain, or mental illness might have been festering beneath the surface, it all crystallized into one irreversible moment. One act that would change the course of not just her life, but her family's, forever. That's the thing about stories like this. They don't always come with clear motives. They don't always offer us neat timelines or easy villains. Sometimes they come disguised as normal days, normal posts, normal teenage girls, until they don't. It happened sometime in the early hours of February 22nd, while the rest of the house was still asleep. There were no screams, no shouts, no noise to alert the neighbors, no barking dog, just silence, followed by something unthinkable. Claire Miller left her room and walked into the kitchen. She opened a drawer and took out a large kitchen knife, a tool meant for dinner prep, for meals around a family table. But in Claire's hands, it became something else entirely. She carried the knife down the hallway toward her sister's bedroom. Helen was asleep. She couldn't speak, couldn't move easily, couldn't fight back. She trusted her sister, and she was helpless. Claire entered the room and began stabbing her. The exact number of wounds hasn't been publicly released, but according to the autopsy, Helen died from multiple stab wounds to the neck. Defensive wounds were never mentioned, likely because she never had the chance to defend herself. At some point during or after the attack, Claire took a pillow and placed it over Helen's face. The knife was still embedded in her neck. The pillow, whether used to smother, to hide, or simply as a twisted afterthought, was left on top of her. Now, why would someone cover the face of their victim? Criminal psychologists often point to emotional closeness. Covering a face might indicate guilt. It might mean the perpetrator couldn't bear to look at what they had done, or at who they had done it to. It's an act that can suggest regret, or at least a flash of human connection in the midst of something monstrous. It's also possible Claire was trying to cover up the scene, to muffle the sight, to erase, even symbolically, the horror of her actions. We may never know. After the stabbing, Claire didn't run. She didn't hide the weapon. She didn't try to stage a robbery or make up a story. Instead, she walked outside, into the cold, into the snow, and she dialed 911. In the audio recording, which has never been publicly released but has been referenced by law enforcement, Claire is reportedly hysterical. She tells the dispatcher she killed her sister. She begs them to come quickly. Her voice, according to those who heard it, is filled with genuine panic. When police arrived, she was still out front, trying to scrub the blood from her hands in the snow. She said, over and over, "I stopped my sister." And when asked where Helen was, Claire led the officers inside, willingly, calmly, as if she knew there was no undoing it, as if she had already accepted what she had done. The officers entered the room and found Helen in bed. They tried to resuscitate her. They hoped, maybe, just maybe, that there was still time. But there wasn't. Helen was pronounced dead at 4:13 a.m. All of this happened while her parents were asleep. They had no idea, no warning. They had gone to bed in a safe, warm home with both their daughters alive, and within hours they were standing in a living nightmare. There are no words for that kind of devastation. To lose one daughter in the most violent way imaginable, and to lose the other to the criminal justice system, all in the same moment. The world outside hadn't even woken up yet, but inside that house, everything had changed. As the sun came up over Mannheim Township, the world was still unaware of what had happened inside the Miller home. But that wouldn't last long. News travels fast, especially when there's a headline like this: a 14-year-old girl accused of murdering her disabled sister in their own home. It was tragic, it was shocking, and it had just enough of a digital twist to send the internet into a full-blown frenzy. Because Claire Miller wasn't just any teenager. She had a TikTok account, and in the age of social media, that changes everything. Claire's account, allegedly under the username at Spirits and Such Consulting, was a mix of anime content, popular lip syncs, moody Gen Z humor, and the occasional glimpse into her personal life. At the time of the murder, she had around 22,000 followers. a decent following for a young teen who wasn't a public figure, influencer, or content creator. But once the news hit, that number skyrocketed. She gained more than 11,000 followers after the story broke. People started combing through her old videos, looking for clues, hints, warning signs, anything that might have foreshadowed what she was about to do. Her videos began circulating across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit. Screenshots of her face were everywhere. Some people claimed they could see the evil in her eyes. Others insisted she looked totally normal, like any other 14-year-old girl trying to find her place online. And that, they argued, was the most terrifying part. There were no obvious signs, no disturbing rants, no creepy monologues. Claire never even spoke in her videos. She lip-synced. She used trending sounds. She stared into the camera with that blank, detached expression that teenagers have perfected on social media. In fact, to most viewers, she came across as shy, quiet, maybe a little strange, but not dangerous, not capable of violence, not the kind of person you'd expect to see trending under headlines that use the words TikTok killer. But the internet doesn't care about nuance. Comment sections flooded with the worst kind of responses: mockery, memes, insensitive jokes. People made edits using her face. They used Helen's name as a punchline. They turned a murder into a moment of content, as if none of it were real, as if there wasn't a grieving family behind the screen. It was disgusting, and sadly, it wasn't surprising. This is what the world does now. When tragedy strikes, the first instinct isn't to reflect, or mourn, or understand. It's to dissect, to meme. We scroll, we click, we comment, and then we move on to the next scandal. Eventually, TikTok stepped in. Claire's account was deleted for violating the platform's community guidelines. According to their policy, any user involved in violent criminal activity, even outside the app, is subject to removal. But the damage was already done. Her videos had been saved, re-uploaded, analyzed frame by frame. She had become part of the internet's macabre hall of fame, an unwilling viral figure in a story far bigger and far sadder than anything she had ever posted online. And the most painful part? Helen, who was the actual victim, was barely mentioned. Her name was a footnote. Her story was buried beneath the spectacle. All eyes were on Claire, on her TikTok, on her face, on the mystery of how someone so seemingly ordinary could do something so horrifying. But while the world obsessed over the TikTok killer, the Miller family was trying to plan a funeral. They were grieving one daughter and trying to figure out what to do about the other. If you heard about this case when it first broke, there's a good chance you remember the glove video. It was everywhere. A short, eerie TikTok clip. A gloved hand holding a stuffed giraffe. Blood, real or fake, smeared across both. The camera pans to a snowy ground, stained red. The implication? That this was posted by Claire Miller after she murdered her sister. It didn't take long for screenshots to go viral. People were reposting it to YouTube, to Twitter, to Reddit. True crime TikTokers were using it in their breakdowns. Major tabloids ran with it. The Daily Mail, The Sun, others like them, using stills from the video as visual proof that Claire had documented the murder in real time. But there was just one problem. The video wasn't hers. Despite how widely it was shared, there is no verified connection between Claire Miller and the so-called glove video. In fact, after a deeper look, it becomes pretty clear that this was nothing more than viral misinformation, an internet rumor that spiraled into accepted truth without anyone stopping to ask where it came from. Here's what we actually know. The video in question first surfaced online shortly after the news of the murder broke. It showed a close-up of what looked like a blood-covered glove and a giraffe plush toy. It was shaky, disturbing, shot in the snow, just like the crime scene. The timing made it feel authentic, and people ran with it. But if you actually go looking for the original post, it's nowhere to be found. That's because, according to dozens of commenters on re-uploads of the video, it wasn't posted by Claire at all. Multiple users across TikTok and YouTube claimed they'd seen the clip before, from a completely different creator who was making an ARG, an alternate reality game, essentially a fictional narrative told through cryptic, stylized videos. The blood wasn't blood, it was food coloring. The video was meant to be spooky, but someone, somewhere, grabbed it and attached Claire's name to it, and the internet never looked back. Other people claim Claire may have reposted it, not realizing how it would later be interpreted. But again, there's no confirmed evidence that she did. No account history. No traceable digital footprint. Nothing verified. Even TikTok never acknowledged the glove video in their statement about deleting Claire's account. There's no police confirmation. No court documentation linking that video to Claire in any way. And here's the thing. If Claire had posted something that incriminating, right after committing a murder, it would have been all over the police reports. It would have been a central part of the case. But it wasn't, because it didn't exist, at least not in the way people believed. And yet, even now, you'll still find people online who swear that video is real, that it's the smoking gun, that it proves Claire planned this, that it gives us insight into her mind. But what it actually proves is something far more disturbing. It proves how easily we let fiction become fact, how willing we are to twist tragedy into entertainment, how quickly we assign guilt and meaning to a piece of footage without ever questioning the source. In the age of viral content, perception becomes reality. It doesn't matter if something is true, it just matters if it feels true. And what's worse is that, once again, Helen was erased from the conversation. While people obsessed over a bloody glove and a stuffed animal, no one was talking about the real girl who lost her life. A 19-year-old woman who deserved better than to become a backdrop for a TikTok horror fantasy. So no, the glove video wasn't part of this case. But the fact that so many people wanted it to be says a lot. In the days that followed Helen Miller's murder, Claire was arrested and charged with criminal homicide. There was no dramatic manhunt, no courtroom outbursts. Claire didn't flee or deny what she had done. In fact, from the very first moment, she admitted it. She called 911 herself. She led the police to Helen's body. She confessed. But what happened next wasn't just about guilt. It was about how the justice system treats someone like Claire, someone who was 14 years old at the time of the crime. In most states, there are clear distinctions between juvenile and adult courts. Minors under a certain age are given protections, names withheld from the press, sealed records, sentences focused on rehabilitation instead of punishment. But Pennsylvania is one of the exceptions. In Pennsylvania, if you're charged with homicide, you're automatically tried as an adult, no matter your age, no matter the circumstances, no exceptions. So from the very beginning, Claire's name was released to the media. Her mugshot was circulated online. Her charges were the same as they would be for a 25-year-old. And that decision sparked a wave of debate. Some people argued that the severity of the crime justified it, that a person capable of stabbing their sister to death should face adult consequences. Others, including many in the legal and mental health communities, disagreed, pointing to Claire's age, her apparent mental state, and the neurological science that shows how drastically teen brains differ from adults. Let's be clear, no one is saying Claire shouldn't be held accountable. But the question is, how should that accountability look? Claire's defense attorney, Robert Byer, filed a motion to have her case moved to juvenile court. If successful, the shift would mean a completely different path. Less emphasis on punishment, more on psychiatric evaluation, therapy, and long-term rehabilitation. But so far, that effort has been unsuccessful. The case remains in adult court, and Claire remains in a juvenile detention facility while awaiting trial. Her defense team also announced plans to pursue an insanity defense. Now, for a lot of people, that phrase sounds like a loophole, a get-out-of-jail-free card. But in reality, it's anything but simple. To be found legally insane, a defendant has to meet a strict set of criteria. It's not enough to have a mental illness. You have to prove that, at the time of the crime, you were unable to understand the nature or wrongness of your actions, that you were so disconnected from reality, you couldn't comprehend that what you were doing was wrong. That's a high bar, and statistically, insanity defenses rarely succeed. Still, it may be the best option Claire's legal team has. There's no real question of whether she did it. The question is whether she was mentally capable of understanding what she was doing, and whether she should spend the rest of her life in a prison cell because of it. Because that's the reality here. If Claire is convicted as an adult, she faces life in prison. No parole, no early release, just life. And while the death penalty is technically still on the books in Pennsylvania, it's unlikely to be applied in this case, especially considering her age and mental health. But even life without parole for a 14-year-old is a haunting thought, and it raises difficult questions. Should a child who commits an unthinkable act be treated the same as an adult? Is there room for redemption, for mental health treatment, for rehabilitation? Or do some acts place you beyond the reach of mercy? It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's one we need to have, because Claire's case is not the only one, and our system's response says a lot about what we believe justice really is. As of now, Claire Miller is still awaiting trial. She remains in custody. She remains a child. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, there's a family still trying to understand how their world fell apart in a single night. When something this horrifying happens, the question that echoes louder than any other is, why? Why would a 14-year-old girl, by all appearances stable, supported, and intelligent, pick up a knife and end the life of her own sister? There's no definitive answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But there are theories. Some of them grounded in psychological research, others in pure speculation, and all of them to some degree uncomfortable. Let's start with the most common theory: parentification. Parentification is when a child is placed into a caregiving role that exceeds what's emotionally or developmentally appropriate. In some families where a child has a disability or chronic illness, it's not uncommon for siblings to be pulled into roles that go far beyond helping out. They become secondary parents, nurses, emotional supports, quiet martyrs, and sometimes they crack. There is speculation, particularly in online forums and among disability advocates, that Claire may have been experiencing this dynamic, that her parents, perhaps unintentionally, placed too much responsibility on her shoulders, that she felt pressure to be there for Helen in ways that no young teenager should be expected to manage. She reportedly accompanied Helen to medical appointments, helped with care, was present during difficult times. And while none of that in itself is damning, it does raise a question. Was Claire carrying the weight of something far heavier than anyone realized? We don't have proof. There's no public record accusing the parents of neglect or abuse. But in cases like these, it's impossible not to consider the invisible emotional labor that can exist in families navigating disability. If Claire was overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, and lacked the tools to process that, it might help explain her state of mind. It wouldn't excuse it, but it might begin to answer that impossible question. Why? Another theory? Jealousy. As cruel as it may sound, jealousy among siblings, especially when one has a disability, is more common than people like to admit. It's not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it simmers, quietly, for years. Parents, out of necessity, may devote more time, attention, and resources to the child with medical needs. And even when done with love, it can leave the other sibling feeling invisible, overlooked, resentful. There's an entire Reddit thread where users, many of whom grew up with disabled siblings, discuss this dynamic. One user admitted to feeling crushing guilt over how resentful they felt as a teenager. Another confessed to daydreaming about running away just to escape the emotional pressure. They weren't violent. They didn't act on those thoughts. But the emotional complexity was very real. And maybe in Claire's case, something inside her gave out. There's also a third theory, one that's harder to talk about: mental illness. Remember, a friend claimed that Claire spoke to them before the murder, that she confessed to having homicidal and suicidal thoughts. If that's true, and if no one intervened, then we're talking about a mental health crisis that wasn't just missed, but ignored. We don't know if Claire had a formal diagnosis. We don't know if she was in therapy, on medication, or even being evaluated for anything. But we do know that she did something that defies logic, compassion, and reason. And in many cases like this, severe mental illness plays a role. If Claire was struggling with something like depression, psychosis, or a mood disorder, it's possible her perception of reality was altered, that she believed in that moment that she was acting with purpose, even if it made no sense to the rest of us. Some have speculated that she experienced a break from reality, that the pressure, the darkness, the loneliness all collided in one irreversible act. We can only guess, but perhaps the most heartbreaking part of all of this is that Helen never had a chance. She was vulnerable, dependent, trusting, and she deserved safety. She deserved protection, not just from her family, but from the systems and communities that failed to notice the warning signs, that failed to see what was happening beneath the surface of Claire's carefully curated online presence. Because no matter what the motive was, burnout, jealousy, mental illness, or a combination of all three, Helen Miller didn't cause it. She was not a burden. She was not the problem. She was a 19-year-old woman with a vibrant spirit, a love for art, and a life that mattered, and she's the one who should be at the center of this story. Helen Miller was 19 years old. She lived with cerebral palsy, a condition that affected her mobility and speech. She used a wheelchair. She was nonverbal, but that didn't mean she wasn't expressive. According to the few public records available, Helen was warm, observant, creative. People close to the family described her as someone who brought light into a room, someone who didn't need words to make her presence felt. She was also an artist. She painted, sculpted, and explored different forms of visual expression. One of her watercolor pieces even won an award, though there's little publicly available about which piece it was, or where it was displayed. Information about Helen is limited. Most of what's known comes from obituary notices and sparse media mentions. The coverage surrounding this case, like so many others, has focused almost entirely on the person who committed the crime. But Helen existed far beyond that one night. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, a young woman with a quiet passion for art and a life shaped by both challenges and care. She had a future her family had tried to plan for. Years earlier, her parents had established an irrevocable trust in her name to ensure long-term support. That kind of preparation points to love, to intention, and to hope for what was ahead. She wasn't a viral moment. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't a detail in someone else's breakdown. She was a person. And whatever led Claire Miller to do what she did, it's important to recognize that Helen didn't choose that moment. She didn't provoke it. She didn't deserve it. She was asleep in her room, in her own home, in a place that should have been safe. That's the part that lingers. Not just the tragedy of her death, but the absence of her life in the way the story has been told. So if anything should be remembered, it's that Helen Miller lived. She made things. She felt things. She had value. Her life mattered. That's all. This case is one of the more difficult ones to sit with. Not because it's graphic, though it is. Not even because of the age of the person responsible. but because it forces you to sit in a space where nothing feels clear. There's no satisfying resolution here, no obvious motive, no closure, just loss. Helen is gone. Claire is behind bars, awaiting trial. And their parents, who did what most parents do, tried to keep their family stable, tried to care for both of their daughters, are left in the aftermath, carrying something that can't really be explained to anyone else. The internet has already moved on. That's how this works. A spike of interest, then silence. The hashtags slow down. The comments dry up. And all that's left is the people directly affected, trying to rebuild something that will never be what it was. Looking at Claire's story, there are a dozen angles you could take: psychological, legal, social. But the hardest thing to accept is that this might just be one of those situations where you never fully understand why. And that's unsettling. We like answers. We like to name what went wrong. We like to box things up so they make sense. But sometimes the answers don't come. Sometimes you're just left with the pieces. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's enough to acknowledge what happened without trying to explain it away. Maybe it's enough to hold space for what was lost. A young woman who should still be here. A family changed forever. A story that didn't need to happen, but did. There's no message to take from this. No bigger lesson. No moral to wrap it up neatly. It's just a tragedy. And maybe the only thing to do with a story like this is to treat it carefully. To remember that the people involved were real. And that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is sit with the weight of that for just a moment and let it be heavy. That brings us to the end of the story. There's no real conclusion here, just a pause. The case is still open. Claire Miller is still awaiting trial. And as of now, no final verdict has been reached. Her legal team continues to pursue options. The state continues to prepare. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the Miller family continues to live with the quiet aftermath of something irreversible. Whatever happens next, it won't undo what's already been done. Helen Miller is gone, and that fact is fixed. So if there's anything to take from this, anything at all, it's just the reminder that people are always more than what makes the news. That behind every headline is a family, a quiet home, a person who had routines and talents and favorite shows and memories and plans. Helen mattered before this story, and she still matters now. Thanks for spending time here, especially on something heavy. I know these stories are hard to listen to. They should be. Take care of yourself. Take a break if you need one. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by this story or anything else, don't keep that to yourself. That's going to do it for this episode of Crime Scene Confidential. If this case left you stunned like it did us, let me know what you think over on the YouTube channel. I read every comment. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime, make sure you're subscribed. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay curious.